A new One Persuasion poll commissioned by True North found that a majority of Canadians wanted to defund the CBC, that young Canadians are more likely to support increasing media subsidies, and that a majority of Canadians believe media subsidies impact impartiality. Well, as Canada gears up to approach a federal election in a year's time, how much will the ongoing debate between choosing to fund or defund the CBC play in the months ahead? Joining us to break down the data and to walk us through the findings is Hamish Marshall, political strategist, pollster, and partner at One Persuasion. Hamish, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here as always, Harrison.
So in the recent poll that True North commissioned and your team conducted, one of the standout questions and really one of the answers that we found interesting was that only half of 2021 Liberal voters, approximately half of both Liberal and NDP voters, would support fully funding the CBC, meaning that the push to defund the CBC seems to really be working and actually breaking through party barriers. Is that one of the findings that you found to be interesting as well?
Yeah, absolutely. The numbers here are staggering in that the number of folks who are in favor of fully funding the CBC, keeping the model the same way it is today, has just collapsed, and it's across the political spectrum. Of course, we see very few conservatives wanting to keep the status quo. That shouldn't be a giant surprise. It's obviously one of Pierre Poilievre's signature campaign issues when he ran for the leadership, and he's kept on talking about it. It's certainly doing very, very well for him with conservatives. But the fact that it's only about half of NDPers, 55% of Liberals want to keep the funding model the same, I think really speaks to the CBC's. Look, I think there's a couple things going on here. One is the general decline of media and people just moving away from the old school mainstream media to platforms like True North. But also the CBC in particular has done such an appalling job of in the last, say, 15 or 20 years of building those links with Canadians that maybe it once had. And that I think we're seeing that in these numbers.
And one of the things that we've seen has been really conservatives either willing to stand and fight on the defunding of the CBC issue, or in some cases, like in the last federal election, almost completely abandoning that issue once Aaron O'Toole, for example, became the leader. Do you think that this is going to strengthen the message from Pierre Poilievre? Is he going to continue to go for maybe a full defunding now, or is he going to try to maintain a middle line approach where some parts of the CBC are going to be defunded, but others, like some of the French-speaking radio as well and rural services, will be kept? How do you think that's going to change Poilievre's approach heading into the next election?
I think what all this does is confirms his approach thus far, right? The English CBC, especially the television branch, is in real trouble. Poilievre, the support for it is very low. Poilievre is absolutely going to keep that promise and go after that and defund that. There's no doubt in my mind of that. I think the situation in Quebec in particular is a little different. Obviously, it's a different media environment. The number of sources of media in French, even the number of independent sources, is a lot less, and as a result, there's more support for the CBC, broadly speaking. Although it is interesting that when you look at even at the Quebec numbers, still there 24% want to in Quebec want to stop funding the CBC entirely, and only 40% say keep it as it is. So even there's more of an appetite today than I think there was a year ago, but Quebec's going to be trickier for sure.
The other question that you guys were focusing in on this poll it had to do with media subsidies and basically bailing out the newspapers and media companies that the federal government has been doing for quite a while. And it found that actually a majority of Canadians believe that taking federal money impacts impartiality. And I found that it was I believe it was younger Canadians actually the most who believed that taking federal funding impacted impartiality.
That's right.
There's not too. Is that correct?
That is correct. Young men under 35, for instance, almost 70% think that taking subsidies will impart their impartiality when it comes to reporting on the government.
And so I found that was very interesting. But also the findings indicate that a majority of Canadians are not interested in removing those subsidies. So they believe that they will impact impartiality, but they actually don't want to eliminate the subsidies for the media. Was that a surprise when you guys were asking that question and got these results?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a surprise, although it's important to note that the largest segment by far are people who moderately agree with the statement, or people who say we should maintain the current level. People aren't looking to increase the subsidy levels either. They're looking to sort of continue where it is. I think Canadians are generally struggling with the situation they have with the media. They know the media is in a lot of trouble. They're not prepared to go and spend money on the media the way they conventionally had to when you supported ad-funded TV or bought newspapers back when I was a kid. But they know they want it to keep going in some way, shape, or form. And while there's dissatisfaction, I think, with the current model, they don't have a better one in mind. So what this says to me is there's a lot of disquiet. The concern about influence and about impartiality is one of them. And if somebody came along and said, here's a better model to make sure we have a robust media environment in Canada, that would probably be quite popular. But right now, in the absence of something different, they're saying the current system's, it's okay.
Right. And do you think that Poilievre will want to, if he wins, you think he'll want to go in and attempt to slash a lot of these subsidies? It's not something that he talks about as much as he does regarding the CBC. How do you think a Pierre Poilievre government would approach the media subsidy system?
Well, I think we've got a huge problem in this country in the whole sort of cultural space, whether it's the news, whether it's, we've seen different attempts in the past on taxing Netflix and Apple TV Plus. I mean, all this sort of the fact of the matter is that our entire cultural policy when it comes to media and entertainment in this country is from the pre-internet era, definitely the pre-streaming era, and bits of legislation have been cobbled onto it. So I think the most likely thing is that there's an opportunity to kind of rewrite that whole environment, everything from the other subsidies that exists for CanCon and the CRTC rules, and I think you could see a rejigging of things in the context of an overall reform of the system, and frankly, just updating the system to deal with the realities of living in 2024 or 2025, and not on this weird patchwork system that sort of grew up in the late 90s.
Did you find that when it came to questions about the media that there was a large divide between education levels? Because I feel like that also determines how people consume media, depending on what education level they have. Usually there's quite a divide, but was there a major divide in answers regarding education?
Absolutely. So for instance, people with a university degree or a postgraduate degree were much more likely to be in favor of continuing to fully fund the CBC. Amongst people who have a trade or college degree or a trade or community college certificate, that number drops to only 31% of people who want to see the CBC continue as it currently exists. Support for subsidies is higher with better educated people, but interestingly enough, concern about impartiality is also highest with people with the most education. They're the most aware of it likely to be a problem. And but again, that goes to what I was saying, that I think there's dissatisfaction with the current system, but there's confusion about what else there could be.
Right. And just kind of moving outside of the questions regarding the media, just broadly speaking, we know that the Liberals have been almost stuck in place when it comes to public opinion. They have not been able to capitalize on any effort recently to gain popularity in the polls. Has anything changed, or do you see anything that could possibly change in the next 12 months as we approach the end of Justin Trudeau's third mandate?
I think a lot of people who have decided they're not for the Liberals, they don't like Trudeau, are now just tuning them out. So they could come out and announce some phenomenally exciting policy next week, and a huge chunk of the electorate would just say, I don't care. I don't listen to anything those guys say. And I think they're in that problem that everything they say, I mean, they were very excited about the budget they rolled out in the spring. I'm not quite sure why. I understand why it flopped, but I also understand that a whole bunch of people who might have liked some things in it, I don't know, but they just weren't listening. And that's the big, big problem that they have, is that once people have decided they dislike a politician intensely, it doesn't matter what they say. It's very, very difficult to turn that around, especially a politician that's been in office for a long time. Maybe after a year or two, and you're beginning to say, well, I don't like this leader as much as I once did, but they did something cool and exciting. They'd be more willing to come back. But at this stage, 9 years in, There's almost nothing I think they can do. But a lot of it's tied up with Trudeau. I mean, I guess if Trudeau quit, I think they would have. I don't think they would. I still think they would lose, but I think they would gain some. There would be a change there. If they could talk a little bit about change or some credibility if they had a new leader.
And do you think that what goes on in the United States during the presidential election might impact how voters in Canada think when they head to the polls later on?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can expect the Trudeau Liberals to do everything they can to say that Pierre Poilievre is a carbon copy of Donald Trump, and I think they're going to be pushing that line very, very hard. They're at the stage in the government right now where they have run out of ideas, and they're just going to go back to the old hits. So they're going to absolutely try that. I don't think it's going to work very well for many of the same reasons that I just said, that people are just tuning them out. Once people have decided they dislike Trudeau as intensely as they clearly do, they're just tuning out everything he says.
Do you feel like some of the major pieces of legislation that have come in regarding access to news in Canada, C-63 being one of them that basically shut down news access on Facebook, has that impacted the way Canadians operate and view the news as well? Like, I imagine that belief in trust hasn't been fixed by anything that the federal government has tried to do with media.
No, I think just the opposite. I don't have a study to back this up, but anecdotally, I would argue, I think Canadians are consuming less Canadian news as a result of this. I think people are sharing less links. They know they're not going to work. People are, I mean, I just think personally, the amount of discovery of news stories that came out of social media for me that has just vanished. And I think, and I'm someone who's someone who's fairly interested in the news. And if someone was sort of a much lower intensity news consumer, those headlines that aren't getting seen, those stories that aren't getting linked to, I think it's dramatically decreased it. And one of the interesting things on the CBC website, if you read a story on their website, it will often show you the number of people reading the top 4 or 5 stories at any given time. And it's fascinating. The number of that has dramatically dropped. There was a time a couple of years ago when, whatever the top story of the day was, you might say 18, 19, 20,000 people reading the story at once. Now you go on there, it's 3, 4, 5,000. So I think they're suffering a lot from it not coming from Facebook. And I imagine it's the same across all of the media.
I want to just jump to the other side of the country here and to British Columbia, because we know that there is an election coming up there in October. And the BC Conservatives have been they've really put themselves in a position where they could potentially win, being the third party, and now they might end up winning. What are you seeing on the ground there? And has there been anything that has shifted public opinion in a considerable way against the BC NDP toward the BC Conservatives in that province as they lead up to an election?
Look, the NDP hasn't actually dropped that much. The NDP is, depending on the poll, has dropped 5 or 6 points from the last election. A lot of that's due to the fact they've been in power a long time. They have a less popular leader in David Eby. John Horgan was a very popular guy who appealed across party lines. So the fact that the NDP is down from 47 what they got in the last election to sort of the low 40s isn't much of a surprise. BC Conservatives have mainly gained the old BC Liberal, now BC United vote. Primarily, they're somewhere in the high 30s. I'm skeptical. Maybe they can pull it off. Maybe they can't. The polling I did a couple months ago, we looked at time for a change, desire for people to change the government. And what we found is that the people who were most intensely hated the NDP were all lining up behind the BC Conservatives, and they were very excited about it. But the number of people who were left who wanted a change in government wasn't that huge. So maybe they can do it. Maybe they'll have a good campaign. But also, and I've been there, I've worked with third parties on their rise. Candidates that they selected a year ago when they were a lot lower in the polls can cause a lot of trouble. A lot of their senior team is very untested. So we'll have to wait and see how it goes. But right now, I'm not optimistic that the NDP will be defeated.
In Ontario, it's looking like there may be a snap provincial election in the next month or two. Is there anything there that you think would be a problem for Doug Ford? Do Bonnie Crombie's Liberals look like a threat, or is this just a good chance for them to try to go after them when they're still just starting out?
the biggest strength the Ford government's had in the last election, certainly in the last election, even the election before, is this incredible split between the Liberals and the NDP. It's right down the middle. No one has become the obvious candidate to defeat Ford. Frankly, I got it wrong. I thought in the last provincial election there would be a fight, and by the end of the election, it would be obvious that if you were anti-Ford, you'd line up either behind the NDP or the Liberals, and we'd see that across the province, and one of those parties would end up in the catbird seat. Didn't happen then. Hasn't happened in the last couple of years. Maybe there's an election that'll prompt it to happen, but nothing on the ground. Nothing seems to be indicating that is about to happen, that one of these parties is running away with it or the other. The interesting thing that's going to happen is that if there's a consolidation of the center left vote against Ford with either the Liberals or the NDP, that will make the election much closer than it is today. But we're not seeing that so far, and the results of the most recent by-elections indicate that Ford's sitting in a great position, which is why I think we're hearing a lot of talk about an early election.
Well, when the British Columbians head to the polls in October and when Ontarians head to the polls later on, it'd be nice to have you back to discuss all of that in more detail. But until then, Hamish Marshall, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Harrison.